I was around 8 and had been living in my neighborhood for a little over a year now. It's not the best of neighborhoods, and it wasn't back then either. Lots of low-key drug activity that eventually escalated into a sting operation. But that's another story for another time. So these activities started when I was around 8 years old. But it's important to note that we bought the house from my paternal aunt, who had a string of bad boyfriends. I remember my mom constantly telling me to look out for my aunt's ex-boyfriend, Paul, and if I ever saw his car that I was to come straight home and tell her or my dad. No problem. Now, our house has a small rental property in the back, and the lady that had lived there moved out a few months after my aunt did, and we didn't try to rent it again. We just locked it up and left it alone. It always gave me bad vibes as a kid. I just hated it, especially because my parents split and were going through divorce procedures, so my dad lived about 30 minutes away, and it was just me and my mom. I was a weirdly anxious child when it came to my mother. Like there was a week where I cried in bed with her because I was so afraid of her dying, and she had to explain to me over and over that it would happen only when I was much, much older. I was very protective of her, but scared for her too. Still am. I always make sure she tells me where she's going if she's going out on a date. So, around this time, I would notice little flashes of lights in the rental house, and I sometimes thought I saw someone in there whenever I would go out to bring my dog inside. This happened numerous times, and each time I would tell my mom, and she would go check it out, no matter how much I begged her not to. I would literally stand at the back door, phone in hand, watching her, and she always told me to call the police if she wasn't back in 5 minutes. I was really scared that it was Paul or something, even though I had never seen his car. My mom never found anything, or if she did find any traces of anyone living there, she never told me. She would just tell me it was my imagination, but I still just got bad vibes from that house, especially at night. I felt like I was being watched. And the thing is, as a kid, I was not overly anxious, except with my mom, or easily spooked. Sure, I had a wild imagination, but I was smart enough to know when I was imagining a monster under the bed, and that it wasn't really there, for example. I was a pretty grounded kid, so I don't know if she ever took my complaints seriously or not. But she did once a cop showed up at our door wanting to search our residence. My friend Alyssa was staying the night with me when the cop knocked on our front door, and we peeked out of my door and heard the policeman asking my mom if she had ever heard of someone named Chris, and then was asking if he could check around our house. She obliged, and he searched high and low and found nothing, but cautioned us to be careful because apparently someone had reported this Chris fellow was at our residence or something and was apparently missing. Oddly, he did not check the rental house. The next day, Alyssa and I go over to her house to ask her brother Tommy and his friends, who had a reputation in the neighborhood of selling pot and stuff, so they knew a lot of people, if they had heard of Chris. He looked over at me really worried, which spooked me because Tommy really hated me for reasons unknown and said, "Yeah, I heard from the Smiths that he and another person were staying in your rental house, but I thought they were just trying to mess with me." Tommy was 11 at the time and gullible, and the Smith kids ranged from 13 to 17, minus the youngest who was only 6. So I guess he didn't say anything sooner because he didn't want to look like a fool or a narc. He asks us why we asked, and I told him a policeman showed up looking for him, and he just shook his head and said, "No one has heard from him or the other person he was with in a while." And although I was freaked out, the conversation literally melted away from my mind since I was a kid and I was busy having fun and playing with my friends all day. That night, however, this car pulled into our driveway next to the rental house, and my mom looks out the back door and says she has no idea who it is. So I follow her out because no stranger is going to mess with my mama, and there are 2 older men in the car. The driver rolls down his window and asks my mom if this is our address. She confirms and asks why, and he says that his son was staying with his friend Chris here, and that the son had said he would be in the small house in the back, but no one answered when they knocked. Confused, my mom told them no one had lived there in quite some time, and the father apologized profusely and said maybe he just had a mix-up and left. I recounted the story Tommy had told me earlier after we were back inside. Of course, my mom called the police, and they searched the house and found a few signs that someone had been staying there in the garage. So of course my mom changed all the locks, and the cops keep an eye on the place for a time, but nothing ever came of it. It is not the first or the last time someone broke into our rental house to crash in it, but it was the scariest for me, I guess, because I was so young, and I had been seeing those lights and people in the house. Not only that, but my mom had been in the house searching for them while they were most likely hiding in the garage, which was packed full of junk from the last tenant. Needless to say, she took my claims seriously after that when I thought I saw lights in the house. I have no idea what happened to Chris or his friend, and my mom isn't quite sure either, but she assumes he's okay since the police never showed back up. From my early 20s to my mid to late 30s, I was a Garda officer in Ireland. That's what we call the police in Ireland. I served a small community on the west coast, isolated from any other community, no trains, no nearby airport, no taxis, no Uber, and only one bus a day. This is probably the only reason they had their own Gardaí station. Most other small hamlets just rely on the Gardaí from the nearest town, but given this town's absolute isolation, in a very small country, they needed this station. The hamlet covered a wide area of farm plots and a number of empty and derelict properties. When Ireland became industrialized, most people in these rural communities moved out to go to the cities, in hopes of easier and better paying jobs. The hamlet has a very creepy feeling to it. Most residents here are some of the most down-to-earth people on the planet. But to the story, our Gardaí station consisted of 3 dispatchers. Most calls were routed to another center. Around 7 officers, most from out of town. We all knew each other well, and when we do get a call from the area, even if it is not an important issue, most of us come down, just so we have something to do during our long shifts with very little activity. One night we received a call from a landline phone, originating from a derelict property on the edge of the hamlet, isolated from the other plots of land. I was asked to go alone, as every officer on this side of the county was attending a fatal 3-car and 2-lorry crash that occurred on a nearby motorway. So I walked outside, to the cold wind blowing over my skin. I got in my car and drove down to the property. No lights, no sirens. The call had been a hang-up, lasted no longer than 13 seconds according to dispatch. As I pulled up to the blackened, beat-up property, I felt a shiver go down my spine. The old wooden farmhouse gave off a feeling that I cannot describe or put into words. I didn't feel like I was welcome. I got out of my car, walked to the front of the property, opened the moldy, wet gate, and slowly approached the tall front door. I knocked heavily and exclaimed, "Hello, this is Officer. I'm from the Gardaí. Would you let me in?" I got no response. After waiting for 20 seconds or so, I knocked again and asked, "Hello, I'm afraid that if you do not answer the door, I may have to make forced entry. Please come to the door. This is the Gardaí." Again, no response. I almost wished there was, though, just so I would feel less lonely and vulnerable. I got on the radio and asked dispatch for backup, and that there could be people in the property, and I need to make forced entry, as no one was answering the door. They replied, saying that I should keep an eye on the property, and they could have an officer from the closest town over here in 25 minutes. I grunted to myself and thanked dispatch. I strolled back to my car, but before I could reach to open the gate at the front of the house, I looked back and saw an old, ill-looking man, unshaven, stare down at me from an attic window. I stared back in shock, pulled out my flashlight, turned it on, and flashed it at the window. The man ducked down. I shouted up at the window, "Sir, you need to come down and get the door. I need to talk to you. We have more Garda officers on the way. Come downstairs." I was unsettled by what this was turning into. I informed dispatch of the man, and they replied saying that they will inform the incoming Garda car that they should turn on the siren and get down here as fast as possible. Dispatch seemed uneasy, to say the least. I stood by the front gate, still no one at the front door, just scanning all of the windows, expecting to see that face. I just couldn't get the man's face out of my mind. He just looked so disturbed. After maybe 20 minutes of the occasional knock on the door and the expected non-existent reply, the car finally pulled up. I informed the 2 officers inside of the situation, and we approached the front door. One of the officers exclaimed in a deep, angry voice, "Sir, please get to this door before we have to get the door for you. As it appears you will not get the door, we need to inform you of how this is going to work. We will knock this door down. Upon our entry, you will stand, hands up, on the other side of the room we enter from. We will handcuff you and you will be taken to the station, questioned or detained. If you have a problem with this, then be sure to ask when you're in our Garda cars, that is." The officer was so demanding, I almost felt he was talking to me. He was a very tall and threatening man. We walked back to his car, and he took out what we call the big red key, a big hunk of metal that we use to break down doors safely and without damaging the door. The two officers grabbed the key, walked to the door and said, 1, 2, 3, barrage, and hit the door 4 solid times before it fell down in one big thump. The house was now open. We grabbed our flashlights in one hand and tasers in the other. We took our first steps inside, and I could hear the shard of glass crunching under our feet. The other officer shouted, "Sir, Garda officers have entered the property. Please reveal yourself with your hands in the air. We are armed with tasers that we are authorized to use." We moved forward slowly, shining the small beams of white light into all corners of the apparently empty living room. Upon noticing the absence of the man in this single downstairs room, we shone our lights up the crooked-looking stairs. But before we could even begin to move up the stairs, a man jumped from the upper floor and onto the stairs. And I mean jumped. He looked insane with his large red eyes staring into my soul. I shouted at the massive beast the man was, "Sir, please place your hands above your head, very slow." Before I could finish my sentence, the man charged down the stairs, yelling. One of the officers screamed, "Taser, taser, taser!" And the man let out a gut-wrenching yell of pain as he flopped to the ground, and we ran towards him, handcuffs ready. We grabbed the man who wouldn't stop rumbling on about a supposed big man who gave him food every day. We placed him in the back of my car. The other officers drove behind me as we headed back to the station. In the car, I did the ordinary, told him his rights and everything that comes with that. But before I could finish, he kept asking if I could tell his ex-wife to get out of the car because she was being rude. I told him that it was just me and him in the car, but he wouldn't stop going on about it. We arrived at the station. We walked the man to the front desk, and when asked for his name, he just replied, "The man you all want to know." Eventually, we put his name and other information as simply unknown. The next day, we were told that the man was going to be picked up by the Irish Intelligence Service. Apparently, once my colleagues had got the name out of the man, he was wanted for stalking a minor, child abuse, 3 charges of that, and possession of child pornography. Knowing what this creepy man had been involved in made it so much worse for me to think about it. Once the service came to pick him up, the man told every officer in the station that he would find a way to get to us and do what God has told me to do. This encounter happened to me and my best friend sometime back in 2007 or 2008. We were both women in our early 20s and sharing an apartment in a major metro area. Not a small town, but not a big city either. Through the short stretch of woods behind our apartment complex, there was a neighborhood of single-family homes. Typical suburban cul-de-sac American middle-class neighborhood, except that this neighborhood was completely unoccupied. Like I said, it was right around 2007 or 2008, so the effects of the American recession were still in full swing. A developer had bought the neighborhood and all the houses to tear down. They had built a nice shiny new street from the main road to the neighborhood, but money probably ran out before the homes could be bulldozed. At least that's my best guess, as there were several stalled construction projects in the area that had met the same fate. There was nothing in the immediate area in the way of shops, stores, or gas stations, just empty residential homes. A bit eerie, but nothing overtly creepy. Being young, adventurous, and having some daytime hours free due to our retail jobs, my bestie and I liked to go on walks in this abandoned neighborhood. There was a short path through some woods, and then you came out onto the main neighborhood street, which started out gravel and turned into asphalt toward the nicer end of the neighborhood with the bigger, newer houses. We'd walk up and down, shooting the shit, maybe surreptitiously hitting a joint, just being young and carefree. One of the homes looked to have a few acres of land, and there was a big field where we'd take blankets and go lay in sometimes. So on the day this encounter takes place, the sun was shining, and there was a brilliant blue sky, probably late summer or early fall. I can't remember exactly. Like I said earlier, the neighborhood was a bit eerie, but on that day, we felt pretty safe. We were on one of our midday abandoned neighborhood strolls when we see a car on the street headed our direction. This was the first time we had ever seen a vehicle there. It was a small blue hatchback. I don't know cars very well, so that's the most specific description I can come up with. Neither one of us gets a good look at the driver's face, but we see there are 2 people in the car. All I can make out is that the driver is male, white, and has brown hair, wearing a blue and white raglan t-shirt. The car rumbles past us on the gravel road and out of sight. We continue on, thinking it was odd, but not that odd. A few minutes later, the car comes back from the direction it came, passing us from behind. It drives out of sight over this little hill, and we figure maybe they got turned around since there's obviously nothing of interest on this road except this abandoned subdivision. We continue walking for another couple of minutes. We reach the little hill, and as we get to the top, we see the car that just drove past us. The car was stopped on the road a little ways ahead of us, just sitting there with its brake lights on. That's when I notice the person in the passenger seat is gone. I find this odd and start internally questioning whether I even saw the passenger at all, until my friend says, "Wasn't there another person?" My hackles start to go up and I'm creeped out at this point. Something about the way that car is just sitting there idling like they're waiting for us. There is nothing of interest behind us where he could have dropped his passenger off, which makes their absence very unsettling. I don't know how long we were standing there staring at this car, possibly with the driver's accomplice having been dropped off behind us and the car in front of us lying in wait, but it felt like forever. I had a cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. My friend and I are both frozen to the spot, hair on the back of our necks standing up, mental alarm bells ringing. It's dawning on me that no one knows where we are. While I'm standing there, frozen in fear, brain frantically trying to figure out how long it would be until my boyfriend would get off work and discover us missing, the car started backing up towards us. Fast. As the car accelerates backward towards us, my friend and I come to our senses and tear off towards the woods, cutting through the backyard of one of the abandoned houses. We frantically bushwhack our way through the short stretch of woods and come out on the opposite side of our apartment complex and run like hell until we reach our building. I have no idea what that driver was doing, what their intentions were, or where his passenger disappeared to,